50 years, a lifetime for some. A stretch of days so long that memories should have faded, names should have been forgotten, and promises. Promises should have turned to dust. But some things do not wither with time. Some bonds, some unanswered questions, remain waiting. Eleanor Whitmore sat alone in the silence of her home. The world outside had changed. Cars moved faster, phones grew smaller, faces of strangers came and went. But here, in this dimly lit room, time had stood still. The air was thick with something unspoken. The walls, lined with photographs yellowed at the edges, seemed to watch her. One picture, in particular, held her gaze. The image of a young man in uniform, his smile frozen in time, his eyes filled with a promise never kept. The cup of tea in her frail hands had long gone cold. She hadn't taken a sip in minutes, maybe longer. The ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner was relentless, steady, unforgiving. Each second that passed felt heavier than the last. Then, a sound. It wasn't loud, not at first. A slow rustle outside. The wind, perhaps. The house had settled with creaks and groans for decades now. This was nothing new. But then, a shadow. Not the movement of leaves, not the shifting of branches. Something else. Someone. Her breath caught, barely noticeable, a mere hitch in her throat. Then a knock. Not tentative. Not the kind of knock from a neighbor or a delivery man, or even a child playing a prank. It was deliberate, measured, once, twice, then silence. Her heart pounded, not fast but deep. The kind of slow, dreadful beat that one feels in their chest, in their ribs, in the very marrow of their bones. The cup in her hands trembled, the porcelain clinking softly against the saucer. She turned her head, eyes locking onto the door. The old brass handle gleamed under the dim light of the lamp. She hadn't had a visitor in weeks. No one came unannounced. And yet, there it was, a presence. For a moment, she didn't move. Then, with the weight of years pressing on her shoulders, she set the cup down. The sound of it meeting the table was small, insignificant, yet it echoed in her ears. Her fingers tightened around the arms of the chair as she pushed herself up. Her legs felt weaker than she remembered. Each step toward the door felt heavier than the last. Her pulse roared in her ears. One step, two, three. A hesitation. She reached out, fingers barely grazing the doorknob before she stopped. Another silence. Not the comfortable kind. Not the peaceful absence of noise. Number. This silence was waiting, watching. She swallowed. Then slowly she turned the handle. The door creaked as it opened inch by inch, revealing the night beyond. And there, standing in the dim glow of the porch light, was a man. Not young, not old, weathered. His face was worn by time, lined with stories untold, etched with moments lost to history. His hair, now streaked with gray, framed eyes that burned with something unspoken. Eyes she knew. Eyes she had once loved. Her breath stopped. A name, his name, formed on her lips but never came. Because she could not believe it. Because she had buried him in her heart decades ago. Because James Callahan was dead. And yet, here he stood. There was a time when James Callahan wasn't just a name etched into memory. There was a time when he was everything. Laughter, warmth, the promise of 1,000 tomorrows. Eleanor Whitmore had once lived in a world where love was tangible, where the simple act of holding his hand made the universe feel small, where the future stretched endlessly ahead like an open road. But the past is a cruel thing. It never asks permission to fade. It only does. And yet in this moment, standing before the impossible, before the man she thought she had lost forever, it all came rushing back. The town of Willow Creek was small. The kind of place where the days moved gently, where people knew each other by name, where life was steady, predictable. And for Eleanor, there was James. She remembered the first time she saw him. A dusty coffee shop, tucked between a bookstore and an old tailor shop. The kind of place where the scent of fresh pastries mixed with the low hum of quiet conversations. She had been sitting by the window, a book open in front of her, though she hadn't been reading. Her mind had been elsewhere, adrift in the soft warmth of a summer afternoon. And then, a shadow passed across her table. A voice, smooth, steady, laced with something unspoken, cut through the moment. "Excuse me, miss, is this seat taken?" She had looked up. And there he was, James Callahan. Young, strong, with the kind of presence that filled a room effortlessly. He had an easy smile, the kind that hinted at a mischief barely contained, eyes that saw people, not just looked at them. She had hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but because something about him made the world tilt slightly. "It is now," she had said, surprised at the confidence in her own voice. He had laughed, deep and rich, before settling into the seat across from her. That was how it began, with a smile, with a conversation that stretched into hours, neither of them noticing as the sun dipped below the horizon, as the coffee in their cups turned cold. It had been effortless, as though they had been waiting for each other all along. Afternoons spent walking along the river, hands barely brushing, conversations that never seemed to end. Late nights, sneaking onto the old school rooftop just to watch the stars. He told her about his dreams, about flying planes, about seeing the world beyond their small town. She told him about her fears, about being left behind, about the ache of missing someone too deeply. "You won't have to," he had said, his fingers lacing through hers. "What if you go and never come back?" she had whispered one night, lying on a blanket in the middle of an open field, staring at the endless sky. He had turned his head, looking at her, his expression unreadable. And then, softly, with absolute certainty, he had spoken the words that would haunt her for a lifetime. "No matter what happens, Ellie, I will come back for you." She had wanted to believe him. God, she had wanted to believe him. A crisp, white envelope. The inked words, formal and distant. James Callahan had been drafted. The war in Vietnam had reached further than anyone had expected, and he was leaving. She had known it was coming. They all did. But knowing and feeling were two different things. It didn't matter how many nights she had spent preparing herself for this moment. When she saw him in that uniform standing at the train station, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, everything unraveled. She hadn't cried. Not at first. She had stood there, the bustling chaos of the station moving around them, people saying goodbyes, lovers clutching hands, mothers holding sons. James had smiled, as if this wasn't the end, as if this wasn't goodbye. "Ellie, don't look at me like that." She had swallowed the lump in her throat. "Like what?" "Like you'll never see me again." The words had caught in her chest. "Promise me," she had whispered, stepping closer, her hands gripping the front of his jacket, desperate. "Ellie, promise me." A pause. And then, as if sealing something unbreakable, his hands had cupped her face, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. "I promise." And then the train had pulled in, steam hissing against the platform, whistles shrieking, voices rising in a crescendo of farewells. And just like that, he was gone. A shadow swallowed by the fog, a name carried away with the wind. She had stood there long after the train had vanished, the air still thick with the scent of smoke and metal. She had stood there waiting, as if, somehow, he would turn back. As if, somehow, he had meant those words in a way the universe would not dare challenge. But war does not honor promises. And as the months passed, as the letters slowed, As the whispers of missing soldiers grew, Eleanor began to understand. Promises could be made. Promises could be broken. And some promises, some were never meant to be kept. Now, 50 years later, standing in the dim glow of her porch light, she was looking into the eyes of a man who should not exist. A man she had buried in her heart decades ago. A man who had promised he would come back. And against all reason, against all logic, he had. James Callahan had returned. But why now? And more importantly, what had kept him away for so long? James Callahan's world had changed the moment he stepped off that train. The scent of home, of coffee shops and summer nights, had been replaced by the acrid bite of fuel and sweat, the thick humidity pressing against his skin. The air in Vietnam was different, charged, tense, filled with something unseen, something waiting. The moment his boots hit the dirt, he felt it. War was not a distant thing here. It was alive. It breathed in the rustling leaves, in the whisper of the wind, in the distant echoes of gunfire that never truly stopped. There was no silence in war, only waiting. And then, violence. At first, there were letters. Every chance he got, he wrote to Eleanor. Quick notes scratched onto whatever paper he could find, smudged with dirt, sometimes streaked with sweat, always carrying the same message beneath the ink. "I'm okay. I miss you. I love you. I'll come back." They were careful with their words. The censors wouldn't allow much. He couldn't tell her the truth, couldn't tell her that sleep came in stolen fragments, that the jungle was a beast that swallowed men whole, that sometimes, when the gunfire stopped, the silence was worse. He couldn't tell her about the nights spent staring up at a sky that looked nothing like home, wondering if this would be the mission he wouldn't return from. He couldn't tell her how many times he had watched friends go out on patrol and never come back. So instead, he told her about the sunsets, about how sometimes, when the sky turned red, he swore he could still hear the sound of her laughter. And he promised, over and over again, that he would come home. Then, the letters stopped. At first, Eleanor thought nothing of it. Delays were common. The mail was unreliable. She told herself this. She told herself that if something had happened, she would know. She would feel it. But as the days stretched into weeks, as weeks turned into months, doubt crept in like a slow-moving tide. She found herself standing by the window longer than she should, watching the mailbox, waiting for an envelope that never came. She found herself listening to the radio with an intensity that bordered on obsession, waiting for the mention of names she prayed she wouldn't hear. And then, one morning, as the world stirred awake, as neighbors stepped onto porches and the scent of fresh bread wafted through the air, the letter arrived, not from James, not in his familiar, slanted handwriting. This one was different, cold, official, stamped with the mark of the United States Army. Her hands shook as she opened it. The words blurred, the ink swimming before her eyes, but she forced herself to read them. "We regret to inform you." The rest didn't matter. The words slammed into her chest like a bullet. She gasped, an actual physical sound of something inside her breaking. The world tilted, her knees buckled, and for the first time in a long time, Eleanor fell apart. James Callahan was missing in action. Not dead. Not yet. But lost. Swallowed by the jungle, by the war, by the merciless hands of fate. The town grieved him the way they grieved all their boys who never made it home. His mother wept in the church pew every Sunday. His father never spoke his name again. A plaque was made, a memorial wall etched with the names of the fallen, and on it, his James Callahan, a life cut short, a love story unfinished, a promise unkept. The town moved on. Because that's what people do. They grieve, they cry, they let go. But Eleanor never did. While the world accepted his fate, she refused to. She couldn't. Because in the deepest part of her soul, in the place where his voice still echoed, she swore she could hear him whisper, "Wait for me." And she did. For 50 years, she did. Silence lingers, heavy, unrelenting. The weight of loss is suffocating. But now, standing on that porch, staring into the eyes of the impossible, she felt something she hadn't felt in decades. A heartbeat, a breath, a crack in the illusion of time itself. James Callahan had returned. But where had he been? And why, after all these years, had he come back now? James Callahan was not dead. He was trapped, forgotten by his country, lost in the deep jungles of Southeast Asia, enduring a nightmare no one knew about. The ambush had been swift, merciless. His unit had been moving through thick terrain, the air heavy with moisture, the sun burning overhead. They had orders, a mission, a routine patrol. Then came the gunfire. It erupted from nowhere, cutting through the silence like a blade. The jungle came alive with the screams of men, the deafening roar of explosions, the rapid fire of rifles. Chaos swallowed them whole. James ran. Bullets tore through trees. Bodies fell around him. He shouted orders, tried to regroup, but there was no time. Then pain. A blinding, searing force struck him from behind. His knees buckled. The world blurred. He felt the ground rise to meet him, the scent of earth filling his nostrils as darkness pulled him under. When he woke, he was no longer a soldier. He was a prisoner. The jungle was thick, endless. The camp was buried deep within it, hidden beneath a canopy that let no light in. A place not marked on any map. A place no one would look. His wrists were bound, his ankles chained. The metal cut into his skin, rust mixing with blood. There were others, men who had been there longer than him. Some whispered in hushed voices. Some didn't speak at all. Their eyes were hollow, their bodies thin, their hope already buried. The guards spoke a language he didn't understand. Their voices sharp, barking commands that needed no translation. When they wanted something, they took it. When they were displeased, punishment followed. Time became meaningless. Day bled into night. There were no calendars, no clocks, only hunger, only exhaustion, only the weight of survival pressing down on his bones. And yet, he held on, because of her, because of Eleanor. Her face was the only thing that didn't fade. The sound of her laughter, the warmth of her touch, the promise he made. "No matter what happens, Ellie, I will come back for you." He refused to forget. When he found a broken piece of wood, he carved her name into it, tracing each letter with trembling hands. It was the only thing that kept him sane. But sanity was a fragile thing in a place like this. Escape. It wasn't just a thought. It was an obsession. He tried. The first time, he waited until nightfall. He watched the guards, memorized their movements. When the moment came, he ran. Barefoot, his body weak, but adrenaline pushing him forward. The jungle was thick, but he didn't stop. He could still hear the train station, could still feel Eleanor's hands on his face, could still see the promise in her eyes. Then, shouting. Flashlights, cutting through the darkness. A gunshot. A sharp, searing pain in his leg. Then, hands dragging him back. The next morning, the punishment was swift. The second time, he was smarter. He waited weeks. Let them believe he had broken. Let them lower their guard. But they were always watching, always waiting. Another attempt, another failure, another punishment. It was a game now, a war he refused to lose. Time passed. His body weakened, but his mind sharpened. He learned the jungle, studied the land. He counted the stars, the sunrises, the guard shifts. He listened. He waited. He planned. Because James Callahan was not going to die here. He had made a promise. And a promise, no matter how much time had passed, was a debt that had to be paid. 50 years later, that debt had finally been collected. And now he was home. But home was no longer the place he had left. And Eleanor Whitmore was no longer the woman he had once known. The world moved on. Wars ended. Soldiers returned. Families reunited. But not Eleanor. For her, time had not moved forward. It had frozen on the day she last saw him, on the train platform, where his hands held hers, where his voice promised, "I will come back for you." He never did. The first year was unbearable. She woke up expecting a letter, a telegram, a sign that he was alive. She wrote to the army, demanding answers. They sent none. She searched newspapers, listened to the radio, hoping for a name, a report, anything. Nothing. Days passed, then weeks, then months. The town whispered, "She should move on. She's still waiting for him? Poor girl." They pitied her. They didn't understand. They hadn't heard the certainty in his voice, the unshakable truth in his promise. He wasn't dead. He couldn't be, so she waited. Suitors came, she turned them away. Men who were kind, patient, willing to give her the life she should have had. But they weren't James. No one was, her mother pleaded. "Don't waste your life, Eleanor." Her father was sterner. "The dead don't come back." But she didn't believe it. She held onto the letters, reading them over and over, until the ink faded, until the paper became thin from the touch of her fingers. She kept his photograph on her nightstand, speaking to it in the dark when loneliness became too much to bear. She whispered to the wind, hoping somehow it would carry her voice across the world to wherever he was. "I'm still waiting, James. Come back to me." The years did not wait for her. They pulled her along, whether she was ready or not. Her hair grayed, her hands wrinkled. She stopped expecting letters, stopped listening to the radio for his name, stopped looking at the door every time footsteps sounded outside. Hope did not die all at once. It withered, slowly, painfully, until one day she woke up and realized she had spent more years without him than with him. And still, she loved him. The town moved on. New families arrived. New buildings were built. The war faded into history books, discussed only by scholars and old men who remembered. James Callahan became a name on a plaque, a ghost of a time long gone. She visited the memorial every year, on his birthday, on the anniversary of his disappearance. She placed flowers beneath his name, whispering the words she never got to say. "I love you. I miss you." I never stopped waiting. And then she would walk home alone. A widow without a wedding, a lover without a love, a woman who had waited for a man the world had long forgotten. Until now. Until the night the knock came at the door. Until the moment she opened it and saw him standing there, older, weathered, but alive. James Callahan had come back, just like he promised. But the world had changed, and so had she. There was no single moment when James Callahan decided he would escape. The decision had been made years ago, from the moment he first woke in that jungle camp, bound and beaten. From the first time he heard his captors laugh at his suffering, from the first time he carved Eleanor's name into the wood, he had known he would not die here. The jungle was a living thing, dense and impenetrable. It swallowed men whole, hid them beneath its canopy, let their bones be consumed by time. But James had studied it. For years he had mapped the rhythms of his prison. The guards were careless at night. The shifts changed at unpredictable times. But there were gaps, small, fleeting moments, where the jungle whispered that it was time. His body was weak, scarred. His ribs pressed against his skin, his hands trembled from hunger. But his mind was stronger than it had ever been. Because James Callahan had never forgotten who he was, and he had never forgotten her. The night of the escape was moonless. The jungle air was thick, humid, filled with the scent of wet earth. James lay in the dirt, waiting. His wrists had been unchained, but his ankles were still shackled. A mistake on their part, one he had spent weeks preparing for. A stolen piece of metal. The edge sharpened against stone, hidden beneath his sleeping mat. A weapon in the right hands, a key in his. He worked quickly. The shackle on his left ankle loosened, then the right. He listened. The guards were laughing, playing a game, the sound of dice hitting wood, filling the night. It was now or never. James moved, silent, a shadow among shadows. He slid through the cracks in their world, stepping over sleeping bodies, past rusted bars, past years of torment and lost time. One step, then another, and then a snap, a twig beneath his foot, a small sound. But in the silence, it was deafening. The laughter stopped. A voice barked a command. Flashlights ignited. Then, shouting, he ran. His body screamed, but he ignored it. His breath was ragged. His vision blurred, but he ran. Through the trees, over roots and rocks and memories that tried to drag him down. Bullets tore through the leaves around him. A voice, loud, commanding, ordered him to stop. He didn't. He wouldn't. Because Eleanor was waiting. Because he had promised. Because this was his last chance. A gun fired. A sharp pain tore through his shoulder. He stumbled, fell. But he pushed himself up. He kept running. He ran until the shouting faded. Until the jungle swallowed the sounds of his captors. Until he reached a river, its current strong, its promise of escape stronger. Without hesitation, he threw himself into the water. And then, darkness. When he woke, there was light. Real light. Not the muted, suffocating glow of torches, but the sun, blinding, warm. The scent of salt filled his lungs. Voices. American voices. A hand on his shoulder, shaking him. "Sir, can you hear me?" His lips cracked as they parted. His voice was nothing more than a whisper. "Home." And then, for the first time in 50 years, James Callahan was free. The world he returned to was not the one he left. Cities had grown taller. Cars no longer looked the same. The air smelled different, thick with a kind of noise he hadn't heard in decades. Phones were no longer attached to walls. People no longer wrote letters. The war he had fought in was history, something discussed in documentaries and textbooks, something strangers debated without knowing the weight of it. He was a relic, a man out of time. But Eleanor? Eleanor was still his. If she was still alive. He didn't ask anyone to find her. He didn't look her up online. That wasn't how this was supposed to happen. He had made a promise. And a promise needed to be kept the right way. So he traveled back the way he had left, by train. The same route, the same station. His hands trembled as he stepped onto the platform, memories rushing forward, swallowing him whole. The last time he stood here, he had been young, strong. His heart had been full of a future he believed in. Now he was old, weathered. His body bore the weight of survival, of lost years, of a war that never truly ended. But none of that mattered, because when he stood before her door, the same door he had walked through a lifetime ago, the weight of everything fell away. He raised his hand, knocked, waited, and when it opened, when he saw her, he knew. She had never stopped waiting, and neither had he. The door stood between them, just a few inches of wood, a fragile barrier separating the past from the present, the lost from the found. For a breath, for a moment that stretched longer than time should allow, neither of them moved. James Callahan had imagined this reunion 1,000 different ways. He had prepared himself for rejection, for disbelief, for a door slammed in his face, for a woman who had moved on, built a life without him, buried his memory in a place he could never reach. But as Eleanor Whitmore stood in the dim glow of her porch light, her breath shallow, her hands trembling, he knew. She had been waiting, Her eyes were the same. Everything else had changed. Her hair had faded to silver. Her skin bore the traces of time. Her frame had grown frail. But her eyes were exactly the same. Wide, filled with something between shock and belief, between grief and hope. She took a step forward, then stopped, as if afraid he would disappear if she moved too quickly. Her lips parted, forming a name that never made it into sound. James swallowed. Ellie. Her breath hitched. She lifted a hand, hesitated, then let it fall. He had imagined what she might say, how she might react. Anger, relief, maybe even indifference. But she did none of those things. She only whispered one word. How? It was not an accusation, not a demand, just disbelief. James exhaled, feeling the weight of every lost year settle into his bones. I told you I'd come back. Her face crumpled. A sob, silent, powerful, tore through her. And then she was moving, stepping forward, reaching for him. Her hands gripping his arms, as if testing to see if he was real. When her fingers touched fabric instead of air, when she felt the warmth of his skin beneath his jacket, something inside her broke, her legs buckled. James caught her before she could fall. She clung to him, her body shaking, her tears soaking into the fabric of his shirt. He held her, just like he used to, just like he promised he would. 50 years. 50 years, and she still fit in his arms like she had been made for them. They stood there, wrapped in the kind of silence that needed no words, the kind that carried everything unspoken between two souls that had never stopped waiting for each other. The world had moved on, but in that moment, time collapsed. They were not old, they were not weary. They were James and Eleanor. A soldier and the woman who had never stopped believing in him. After what felt like a lifetime, Eleanor pulled back. Her hands, still trembling, reached for his face. Her fingers traced the lines, the scars, the places time had touched. You're real, she whispered. James smiled, the smallest, most broken smile. Yeah, Ellie, I'm real. She shook her head, her lips pressing together, as if she had 1,000 questions, but didn't know where to start. James beat her to it. You waited for me. A breath, a pause, a truth too heavy to speak aloud. She had waited, even when she told herself she wasn't, even when she stopped looking at the mailbox, stopped listening to the radio, stopped expecting a miracle. She never stopped waiting. Eleanor closed her eyes, exhaling shakily. What else was I supposed to do? James reached into his pocket. His fingers closed around something small, something he had carried for half a century. Slowly, he pulled it out. A ring. Not new, not polished. A simple gold band worn from years of being pressed against his palm, carried through war, through pain, through captivity. He had left it in his locker the day he was deployed. But when he had escaped, when he had made it back, he had found it. And now, standing here on her doorstep, he held it out. I told you I'd come back. Tears filled her eyes, spilling down her cheeks. Her hand trembled as she reached out. She didn't take the ring. She took his hand, clasped it tight. And without another word, she led him inside. Because James Callahan had finally come home, and Eleanor Whitmore was never letting him go again. The door closed behind them, but neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. James followed Eleanor through the familiar space, the same home she had lived in for decades, though time had rearranged it in ways he didn't recognize. The walls bore new frames, but the memories were the same. Photos of her parents, of a childhood long before him. And there, on a small wooden table by the fireplace, a single frame sat apart from the rest. James stepped forward. It was his picture, the one taken before he left when he was young, when the world had not yet stolen time from them. The frame was worn, the edges touched too many times. His throat tightened. "You kept this." Eleanor's voice was quiet. "It was the only piece of you I had." James reached out, his fingers brushing the glass. For 50 years he had been a ghost in this house, a shadow in a frame, a man trapped in the past. Now he was here, and so was she. The night stretched on, but neither of them slept. They sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around cups of tea that neither of them drank. Eleanor listened as James spoke. About the jungle, the prison, the years of survival that felt more like purgatory than life. She didn't interrupt, didn't cry. She just listened. And when he finished, when the weight of every lost year settled between them, she reached across the table and took his hand. "I thought I lost you," James squeezed her fingers. "You never did." Morning came. The world outside woke as it always had, indifferent to the miracle that had unfolded behind this door. The past was gone. The war was over, but love had endured. James Callahan had kept his promise, and Eleanor Whitmore had never let go. Because some loves do not fade, some promises are not broken, and some stories refuse to end.
Some people believe time steals everything from us, but love, true love, waits. It survives. It endures in the spaces between heartbreak and hope, between lost years and second chances. James and Eleanor's story is not just about war. It is not just about survival. It is about the kind of love that refuses to be forgotten, the kind of love that keeps its promises, even when the world believes it's too late. If this story moved you, if it made you believe in the power of love, in the strength of the human spirit, don't let it end here. Subscribe to Rare Tales Unfold, where real stories, lost to time, are brought back to life. Like this video if you believe in second chances. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below. Do you believe love can survive even the longest separations? Because some tales are too rare to be forgotten, and here, we make sure they unfold.